Today we're going to continue our series on Genesis, and we're going to look at the question, how old is the earth? And this is a question that can be considered from different perspectives, different domains of human knowledge. One of these perspectives is that of theology. What does the Bible say as to the question of how old is the earth? Now, interestingly, the Bible does not specifically or does not expressly address the question of how old is the earth. God could have stated in a way that we could record from, this is how you shall number your days from this point in time. He did not do so. God could have identified a pattern of stars in the sky and used that as a method of timekeeping and said, for every inch that this star moves, you know that 100 years have passed. He could have given us express means of timekeeping had he chosen to. He did not. And so when we ask the question today of how old is the earth, we have to infer it from the information we have been given, as opposed to me simply quoting you chapter and verse. Now, one way in which one can answer the question is to take a look at what the people who've been around the longest have to say on it. Now, the Hebrew race started 4,000 years ago, and the Jewish people were intense in their record keeping. There is both the Hebrew Bible, then there is the oral traditions. There were many things that were passed down from generation to generation. Now, it's not in the Jewish Bible that the age of the earth is given. However, the Jewish people have, as a race, kept calendar. And according to the Jewish timeline, which is different from our modern-day Western calendar, it is currently the year 5786. So according to Jewish tradition, the earth is 5786 years old. So that's one measure. Now, another way of understanding this is by looking at the biblical accounts of individual human beings. And if you go and you take the genealogies of Jesus, and there are two of them that are given, one for each of his parents, you can trace his ancestry all the way back to Adam. And what I've done here is I've broken it down for you into 4 columns. The first column is that of human history before God selected a people group. And that starts with Adam. It continues with Seth, the son who was the replacement for Abel, who was slain by his brother Cain. And we go on through here. There'll be some names that you recognize, such as Enoch, the man who never died because he was taken up by God, and Methuselah, who is the longest lived human being at 969 years. And then you'll recognize, of course, the name of Noah, when the human race was narrowed down to just 8 individuals, Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. We pick up from there and we go all the way to Terah, who is the father of Abraham. So that's the first column. The next column is the beginning of the Jewish people, starting with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then Jacob had 12 sons, and one of them was Judah. And if you follow biblical prophecy at all, you know that the Messiah was to come through the line of Judah. And then you'll see a number of other names you may recognize. Boaz is the hero of the book of Ruth. And then we see Jesse, who is David's father. Then David and Solomon. These are the second and third kings of the nation of Israel. And together they presided over the pinnacle of Jewish power. By the end of David's reign, which was a bloody one in terms of foreign conquest, Israel had peace with all of its neighbors. And when Solomon took the throne, he enjoyed truly the golden age of Israel. Now we pick up after Solomon, unfortunately, with Rehoboam and Jeroboam splitting Israel into two kingdoms, northern kingdom and southern kingdom. And from the northern kingdom comes nothing but desolation. Ultimately, it is destroyed, and all the people who were part of it are carried off into captivity. Now, the southern kingdom fares somewhat better. There are a number of good kings of Judah, which was the combination of Judah and Benjamin and Levi. And some of these names you'll recognize: Uzziah, Hezekiah. Then we come to Zerubbabel, and this is the end of the time period that is recorded in the Bible. And this is approximately 430 BC. So we have now another period of time which is not recorded in the Bible. It is known as the intertestamentary period, that 430-year period in which God was silent. So we have that period of time. We have all the ancestors of Jesus during this period of time, all the way through Jesus himself. So this is an unbroken genealogy from Adam to Jesus. If you track the lives of each of these people and measure them, you're going to get about 6,000 years, which coincides nicely with the Jewish perspective on how old the earth is. Now, another attempt to date the earth, to come up with a precise timing of the lifespan of humanity, is thanks to Isaac Newton. And he went through great lengths to stitch together accounts not only from the Bible of different people's ages, but he also synchronized them with different other cultural records from Egyptian, Greek, and Near Eastern civilizations. And from all of his labors, Isaac Newton deduced that the world would today be about 6,026, or roughly 6,000 years. So we have three different accounts, all of which yield approximately the same answer, that the earth is 6,000 years. But I mentioned earlier that there are different ways of answering the question, how old is the earth? Another domain of human knowledge that can answer this question is science. And science employs a completely different methodology for determining the answer. And what I've done for you here is I've summarized 8 of the strongest scientific arguments as to the age of the earth and or the universe. And what we find is there is a stark contrast between what the Bible seems to suggest, which is an age of 6,000 years, and what scientific testing reveals. The first type of testing is called radiometric dating. And this is not a website. This is the process of testing the long-lived isotopes that are found in rocks and meteorites to see how old they are. And based on the decay rates, they've determined that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Almost 1 million times as old as was suggested by the previous interpretations of the Bible. Now, another method of coming up with the age of things is seeing how far that light can travel in a particular period of time and gauging how far various astronomical bodies are from us. So, if you look at a galaxy, and the galaxy is 100 million light years away, then it took the light from that galaxy 100 million years to reach us. And there are objects far, far, far further away than 100 million light years. And incidentally, a light year is the distance that light travels in 1 year, which is just under 6 trillion miles. So interstellar and intergalactic distances truly are vast on a scale almost beyond human comprehension. The next several methods of testing turn scientific attention inward rather than outward. They look at fossil succession, fossil records, and they do different testing to see that the layers of different strata that have accumulated throughout time are not on an age of thousands or even hundreds of thousands or even just millions of years, but really the Earth's age is measured far, far longer, to 4.5 billion years. We see ice cores. That's another way of going back in time. If you drill down in virgin tundra through the ice, it's like a time capsule as to what was happening at the time that a particular layer of ice was deposited. That ice traps in it the gases, the plant matter, whatever it was that was present during the time that ice layer was being deposited. So the further you drill down into the ice core, the further back you can look in time. And by doing this, we can see that time goes back a whole lot further than 6,000 years. The same thing with plate tectonics, looking at the seafloor. The rate of movement is glacial. It's not something where you see activity happening in a time frame of hundreds or thousands of years. Plate tectonics measure movement much more meaningfully in millions of years. And so again, what we see when we examine the floor underneath the oceans is evidence that the Earth is far older than the 6,000 years suggested by biblical accounts. Then we take a look at human records, historical and archaeological. There are many records of civilizations throughout human history. All of the major civilizations are limited to the last 6,000 years. If you look at the Chinese civilization, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, all of the great civilizations that we are aware of are limited to roughly the last 6,000 years, perhaps a little bit longer, but that's the range we're talking about. However, there are cave drawings, there are remains, there are evidences of civilizations that predate 6,000 years by wide margins. So there would appear to be human evidence of an Earth that is far older than 6,000 years. Another way in which we can approach this scientifically is by looking at the differences between human beings genetically. We see that the different races have very distinct signatures genetically. How did we go from one pair of individuals to all of the different races we have today? And we can track the way in which these differences occurred. And they don't occur over the time span of 6,000 years that's been allotted seemingly by the Bible. Finally, we look at the larger scale. We look at the cosmological evidence, the cosmic microwave background radiation. Back in the 1960s, there were some engineers, and they picked up what they thought was basically garbage noise, and they couldn't seem to identify where it was coming from. Well, it turned out to be, in part, the same white noise that you get when you turn on your TV and it's not tuned to a channel. That static you're listening to is, in part, the background hum of the creation of the universe. Based on the cosmological studies that have been done, there's actually a map of what the universe looked like at its earliest point where light was able to be detected. And you can see that there is what's called 3-degree background radiation emitting from everywhere. So you've got different spots that are a little bit hotter than others, But no matter what direction you peer into the sky, there is always at least 3 degrees of temperature radiation coming out. And this is taken as very strong corroborative evidence of the Big Bang, that there was an event, an explosion of time and space that was 13.8 billion years ago. And that explosion of time and space can be detected by you today just by turning on your TV. Now, of course, the scientists can track it far more precisely with their instruments, but it's that same 3-degree background radiation that you can detect yourself. So we also take a look at the expansion of the universe. And if you look at the very largest scales, you see the degree of redshift of galaxies and quasars that are increasing the distance between them and us at unbelievably fast speeds. And we measured the distance to them, and we see that the observable universe is tens of billions of light years across, far more than would be possible in 6,000 years. And so if you're a Christian and you are someone who follows science, how do you reconcile this mountain of scientific evidence that seems to conclusively show that the 6,000-year interpretation of Scripture is wrong? Well, I'd like to approach this in a couple of different ways. The first is to begin by addressing the specific claims. If you look at each one of these scientific proofs that the world is older than 6,000 years, there are scientists whose position is that all of these measurements are misleading, and they have detailed explanations for why each one of them is not correct. And so, for example, let's take a look at number 1. When you examine the rates of radioactive decay in a specimen, say a meteorite, if you're a scientist, you are assuming that the rate of decay today is the same as the rate of decay 100 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 1,000,000,000 years ago. That's your assumption, and it's absolutely unprovable. Science simply needs to make that assumption, or it can't function outside of the window in which humanity has actually lived. And so to be able to extend their inferences back, they make certain assumptions, and that's a key one. And if you question that assumption, then a lot of the strength for that position falls apart. There is, however, an even greater explanation that I'd like to proffer to you, rather than go through all of the different claims here and give you the refutation from the creation scientist point of view. There's a principle that I think explains much of the apparent disconnect between the scientific perspective and the theological perspective. And that is this. When God created in Creation Week, and let's take a look specifically at the Garden of Eden. If you were to take a look somehow through a time portal and examine the trees in that garden, how thick would the trunks be? And it would depend based on what type of tree it was. And for these trees to have mature fruit, they'd have to be a certain age, probably generally it's about 3 to 5 years, maybe longer. And their trunks would have a circumference that was based on the number of years they lived and how fruitful the conditions had been during the years that the tree lived. So the rings show how many years it's lived, and the width of the ring shows what the conditions were for the tree during that year. That's how science works if you're talking about botany. So if you were to take a look at the tree when it was just created and it was an hour old, and you were to look at that tree scientifically with modern scientific instruments, even to the point of cutting the tree down and examining the rings inside it, what would your instrument show you? they would show you that the tree is not an hour old. It's years old, maybe 10 years of age. If you were to take a look, if you were a biologist and you were to examine Adam and Eve an hour after they were they created as embryos or even as newborn infants? No, they were created full grown. They were created mature with all that that implies. So God does not create as raw material. When God brings something into being, he creates it with the appearance of age. It is fully mature and designed for the purpose that God intended. God said it was good, and it wasn't good because it was as of yet unformed. It was fully formed. And so it has the appearance of age, even though it's brand new. So many of these scientific claims can be addressed by the single principle. If you're taking a look at the distance of starlight, and this is a really important example. On day 4, God populates the heavens with the sun, the moon, and the stars. The sun and the moon are relatively close, 240,000 miles and 93 million miles. Light from the sun reaches us in 8 minutes. But stars are tens or hundreds or thousands of light years distant. Think about this puzzle for a moment. If God created stars on day 4, how did the light from those stars reach the earth for them to be visible on day 6? Well, if they weren't created as having already radiated out their light toward us so that from our perspective they would be mature and fully formed, we could never have seen them for years or tens or hundreds or thousands of years. We wouldn't even know there were stars there because the starlight would not have reached us yet. So this is another proof, if you will, that when God creates things, he creates them as having been fully expressed, not the immature version, but the mature version of whatever it is from the perspective of the human viewer. So we see here 2 different measures of the physical realm. We have the scientific measure saying from all of our tools, from our microscopes and our chemistry evaluations and from our telescopes and our radio telescopes, all this data that we're gathering, it converges on a point. And that convergence creates within the scientific community a great deal of confidence. Our answer has to be correct because we keep getting it regardless of the scientific field that we're pursuing. In other words, geology reinforces the same answer as cosmology, as the same answer as biology. All of these different fields are coming up with the answer that the Earth is far, far, far older than 6,000 years. Therefore, we know we are right. However, that confidence may be misplaced because all of science's claims are predicated on the very same assumptions. If the assumptions they're making are misplaced, such as if God creates with apparent age, how would all of their tools be able to distinguish it? And the answer is they cannot. Science is incapable of answering that question, and so you end up with an impasse. The scientist looking at it from the scientific perspective said, this is what my tools show me. This is what the data show. This is correct. The creationist says, I'm not disputing what your instruments show. However, there is another explanation, and it is an explanation that you cannot refute. And the scientist comes back and says, well, you can't prove that. And that's correct. And what we have is an impasse. So what we have is 2 different ways of examining the evidence. The scientist looks at the physical evidence. And here we come to the question of which domain is better at answering the question, how old is the Earth? Science excels at answering the question of how and what. It does a terrible job when answering the purpose questions of why. So we would tend to believe science when it comes to something like, how was the earth structured over time? We see all these different records. It seems very credible to us. Everything that we have learned scientifically definitely leans in that one direction. But it's not conclusive. It can never be, because there are assumptions that are baked in the scientists can never get away from. Now, let's look at the theological perspective, and let's subject it to challenges as well. There are two different perspectives from a Christian worldview. There is the perspective that Genesis teaches, again, even though there's no express time limit that's given, that Genesis teaches that the earth is measured in human lifespans that total about 6,000 years. And that position certainly has been a majority position for much of Christianity's history. However, it has not been the only position. This position, incidentally, is referred to as a young earth perspective, that the earth is young in the sense of being around 6,000 years old. But not all Christians hold to that view. There are many different theories, and we're going to explore them in the coming weeks, that give a theological answer other than 6,000 years as to how old the earth is and the universe is. And not all of these theories are new. There are some, like the gap theory, which is a famous theory that was developed, I believe, in the 19th century. And that posits that there is a gap in time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. Let's go there for a moment. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that is one of the most difficult sentences to understand in all of human writing. It is subject to so many different interpretations, and we'll go through a lot of them together in this series. One of the perspectives is that in between that period, where it says heavens and the earth, period, and when we pick up in verse 2, now the earth was formless and empty, or formless and void. What happened in between that period and the word now? Was there a gap, a period of time in which countless aeons could have passed until humanity's story starts in verse 2? That's the perspective of the gap theory. But that's a relatively modern theory, and it has difficulties. Every theory has difficulties associated with it. A criticism of the gap theory is you invented this theory because in the 1800s, science had grown to the point where they could disprove your age of 6,000 years. And so this was a reactionary theory. In other words, if you're a Christian, you're stuck with the point of view that the earth is 6,000 years, because that's the only thing that Christians believe. There are many people who think that, but that's simply not true. And this is the thing that I wanted to leave you with today. Christians did not suddenly invent an older earth or old earth view in the 1800s because geology forced them to. Long before there was modern science, Christians already interpreted Genesis in different ways, some of which did not require there to be a young earth. And I'll give you a couple of notable examples. Origen, who was 2nd and 3rd century, argued that creation days could not be literal solar days because the sun wasn't even created until day 4. He treated the days as symbolic or non-temporal, in other words, not measures of time, implying that creation could have unfolded over vast, undefined periods. Now, another famous Christian father, Augustine, who was in the 4th and 5th centuries, he explicitly rejected the idea that Genesis described a sequence of literal days. He believed that God created everything instantaneously, and that the days were a literary device that God used to structure the narrative in a way that primitive human minds could comprehend. How could God explain something as incomprehensible as what he might have done using a frame of reference that people would understand? What Augustine posited is that God created just with the exercise of his will, and he imposed this structure on the tale of creation to give mankind something that had a structure it could make sense of and hold on to. So I'm not endorsing either of these views, nor am I disagreeing with them. What I want to do today is to show you that within the realm of theology, of Christianity and Judaism, there is room for many different ways of looking at the scriptures to determine the age of the earth. And in the weeks to come, we're going to do exactly that together.